The Sidebar, Bracewell's podcast devoted to government enforcement investigations, corporate compliance, and white-collar criminal defense. I'm Matthew Nielsen.
And I'm Seth DuCharme.
And we are your host and both partners at Bracewell LLP, where we represent companies, boards of directors, and individuals in all manners of litigation, investigation, and enforcement actions.
Okay, so hello, everyone. Welcome back to Sidebar. I'm here with Matthew Nielsen, and our guest today is Brian Mich from Control Risks. How are you, Brian?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me.
It's good to see you again. Good to see you again. And Matthew, it's always good to see you.
It is you as well, and good to meet you, Brian. So Brian, I guess tell us a little bit about yourself and what do you do? You work with Control Risk, but what is your focus?
Sure. So I'm a partner at Control Risks. I lead our regulatory risk and investigations practice for the Americas region, which includes both North America as well as Central America and South America. Control Risks, for those who don't know, is a now about 47-year-old specialist risk consulting firm. Kind of have an interesting history. We're UK-based, and really we grew out of the insurance industry initially, and we are started as and are still the premier kidnapping and ransom response firm in the world. That has nothing to do with anything I do, but I like saying it because it sounds sexy and interesting. Although I do think that history kind of plays into a lot of what we do, that we've done since our genesis. From that, as not surprisingly, we've grown into doing work in the crisis and security consulting world, which we do everything from complex cyber readiness and cyber response, all the way down to doing executive protection for our clients who are operating in difficult areas. We also then moved into doing and still do global risk advisory work, where we advise clients, corporations who regarding the various regulatory, but maybe even more political and social risks that exist throughout the world in places that they are doing business, they're thinking of doing business, have assets to help them assess their risk. And then from there, kind of moving in a little bit closer to my end of the business, which is more focusing on integrity risk. We have a business intelligence and due diligence practice that, again, helps companies understand relationships that they're intending to enter into, relationships they already have. We use both public record type of due diligence, but maybe even more so. And what we're known particularly for is our use of discrete sourcing queries and business intelligence type of stuff, where we can get kind of on the ground information. And then my end of the business, which is connected to as regulatory risk and investigations, we do everything we focus on is basically in a compliance context, both from a preparedness point of view. We help companies deal with a variety of different compliance related risks, whether it's anti-bribery and corruption or anti-money laundering. We do some work in the antitrust space, and of course, anti-fraud, national security work. We do CFIUS work, as I know Seth knows. And we do that both from a preparedness point of view, is helping companies develop their compliance programs, internal controls, doing risk assessments, but we also do it from a responsive basis, responding to allegations of fraud, corruption, or whatever, and assisting conducting internal investigations. So my end of the business, my background is I'm a former prosecutor in New York City. I was with a couple of different DA's offices over the course of 19 years, where I focused on organized crime and white-collar crime and some high-level narcotics work. But we also have forensic accountants. We have a technology practice that has everything from digital forensics, the ability to acquire information from servers as well as from laptops and other devices. And we also have an e-discovery function. We partner with a couple of different e-discovery businesses, including Relativity One, which is the cloud-based relativity platform. And then we also have a very, very robust data analytical capability that supports both our compliance efforts as well as our investigations efforts. And actually, we use that, and one of the focuses of Control Risks is really the use of data. We become very, very data focused. I think we have this concept, what we call the 4Ds: data-driven, digitally delivered. So we are very conscious of the importance that data places in helping companies, whether you're dealing with monitoring compliance issues, obviously in the context of conducting investigations, whether or not, the full scope. In my practice, I think I mentioned me, but we have other lawyers, but we also have forensic accountants. We have compliance specialists as well. So we can pretty much handle any sort of investigation. In terms of our geographic reach, we are in, I think it's 27 countries. It's either 27 or 28. We just actually opened up an office in Guyana. So that may be the 28th. And we have something like 34 or 35 offices. Here in the U.S., we have actually only 4 here in the U.S. We're in New York, Washington, Houston, and L.A., although we have other people located throughout the country who work for us, and both as employees as well as folks who are subcontracted assets as well. So I think the focus of the firm a lot, obviously, I mentioned we're a risk mitigation firm. I think a big focus of it has been historically helping companies operate in difficult places to operate or dealing with difficult risk-related issues that are the result of regulation. So I think we've worked in something like 150 different countries, and we have something like 70 some odd different language capability just within the firm. So we are pretty global, and all the types of services that I've described that we have here in the United States and the Americas in general, we have throughout our platform. So we can provide those services and that assistance to our clients and their counsel anywhere in the world.
Yeah, that's fantastic.
It occurs to me in listening, to you describe it, Brian, you may have one of the most conveniently self-descriptive company names in your industry, Control Risk. We have a lot of other companies floating around in the space with fancy or cryptic names. It must be convenient for you when people say, "What do?" You just say, "Look at the sign outside the
That's
building.
right.
We control risks of all kinds."
Exactly.
In fact, as you were going through that, I was trying to think of an area of risk assessment or mitigation where you wouldn't be involved to some degree, and it was hard for me to find gaps there. So, Matthew, I don't know if you have any initial questions that come to mind. I had a couple things, but I'll
go ahead.
kick it over to you. So, you talked about, Brian, a familiar term of art, I think, to Matthew and I, having investigators, quote, on the ground, to get familiar with an environment so that they can assess risk and report back to decision makers and stakeholders. Maybe it's a potential counterparty in East Africa or something, or in South America where some of the risk may lie. But I wonder if, from what you see, that notion of having, quote, boots on the ground in the environment when we're living in a digital age, and particularly, during pandemic when a lot of business was conducted, online through Zoom with perhaps less geographic, presence to get to really know your customer, know your client, know your counterparty. And you emphasize data, and data analytics as part of it. But, in the current risk environment, how much do you think now for a company to be comfortable that it has reached the right level of due diligence? How much do you think of it as boots on the ground, and how much do you think is data analytics? And if you are looking at digital information to form a risk assessment, should we have concerns about the reliability, of digital information in a world where we've seen that subject at times, to manipulation, or misdirection? So I know it's kind of a tough thing to quantify, but 47 years or more Control Risk has been doing this, and the world has changed in that time. So I wonder how you see those things coming together, digital due diligence and data versus kind of boots on the ground.
Well, a couple of things. I think that certainly digital due diligence and using data helps certainly, in any of these, whether it's due diligence or investigations or just, compliance monitoring and risk assessments. It certainly helps you to identify the areas of risks to some degree. I mean, I think it helps you figure out where you should be focusing your attention to some extent. And we certainly, in our due diligence, we do a lot of work relying upon information that's, relatively accessible online and through, publicly available sources. A lot of the places our clients operate, though, don't always have the greatest amount of information or the most accurate information that's available online, either because they don't have the same sophistication in terms of, and the robustness in terms of public records. So some work on the ground is often necessary just to get some basic information about who owns a company, who the shareholders are and things like that. But additionally, a lot of times we find that, clients come to us. I had one call in the last couple of days where they're operating in a difficult area where they're focusing on a target, and maybe you have somebody who's actually a somewhat high profile person, and that they're looking, who's part of it, let's say a potential joint venture partner or an acquisition, or could be a third party representative of some sort. And there's a lot of information about those people. And part of the task is trying to figure out, what's the truth. Because, as we have learned, we're not the only people operating necessarily in a contested public media space as we are here in the United States. I think there are parts of the world where there's a lot of things that are said in the media, just like they are here, that are not 100% accurate. So the on the ground resources, I think, are helpful to, in dealing with people who, maybe know the parties, maybe know the targets, or at least know the industry, and kind of getting an understanding, I think, is useful for that purpose. The other thing I think is, and this is particularly because we have been doing the more political and social risk stuff for a long time. I think having, the benefit of having people who are pretty knowledgeable in a very, very kind of granular way about what goes on in some of these countries, I think is very useful to kind of give you context, which I think sometimes it's often hard. I'm an ugly New Yorker. I've lived within 4 hours of this place where we're sitting right now my whole entire life. So, I think it's sometimes hard for us here to understand the context of which the information is being developed. So I think that's also helps as well. And, it helps also to kind of defeat any sort of bias or prejudice that we might have as we're looking at it, to kind of understand it.
Yeah, let's step back for a minute, though. I mean, I think a lot of our listeners may kind of inherently understand some of what we're talking about here. But for those that, don't deal with this on a day-to-day basis, let's talk a little bit about what kind of due diligence a company would want to do, and with whom, right? You've mentioned, maybe counterparties relating to joint ventures, or maybe relating to a transaction. But let's just talk a little bit about why a company would be doing due diligence on someone, and then what kind of concerns, what kind of risk are associated with those, with doing business with people in certain areas of the country, and what kind of things would you be looking at when you're doing these assessments?
Sure. I mean, and that's a pretty broad swath of potential. I mean, obviously, a lot of due diligence we do is, focused on a variety of different regulatory risks that might be in place, right? Whether it's, for the last, I don't know how many years it is now, but, the FCPA bribery focus that has been so much part of it, that could be a focus. It could be money laundering related, a variety of different risks that you're looking at. And part of the reason why you're looking at those, depending upon the context of the relationship you're looking at, is when you, for example, enter into a joint venture, or you are acquiring a company, or you're engaging a party to act as your representative, as your agent, you assume that risk to a large degree of their conduct, right? I mean, and so it's important, one, to try to understand who you're dealing with, so you don't have that risk of them behaving poorly, violating the law on your behalf. And of course, you also want to be able to indicate you've done that due diligence, because when it does happen, part of your defense is that you're going to have to your potential corporate liability will be that, hey, we had a program in place, risk-based, determining, based upon the risk of that party, which can be a lot of different factors. It can be the geography they're operating, the industry, the regulatory environment that industry operates in, a whole host of them. That we determined what the risks are, and we took certain action to identify and hopefully mitigate that risk. And then, so I think that is important to do for that reason. Of course, there's other areas where it becomes important. We're living now in this, kind of world where I think clients are coming to us a lot now to understand their supply chain and things like that, because of issues relating to sanctions, issues relating to resiliency. So they're trying to understand that. So understanding who the parties are in their supply chain has become much more important. And then the other reason, people do due diligence and our business intelligence work sometimes focuses on this is, these people who are running the business that you are thinking of acquiring, or particularly in the acquisition context or getting an interest in, are they good at what they do? Mm-hmm. Not only are they trustworthy, which is really important, and are they risky from a compliance perspective, from a regulatory, but kind of that, what did they have for breakfast? Are they good leaders? Mm-hmm. And that type of stuff, and getting an understanding of that, I think, is really important. Because all too often, particularly companies that are smaller and medium sized, and smaller and medium sized companies have assets all over the world these days. It's not just the Fortune 50 that are, or even Fortune 500 that are global. The global nature of business. Now this may be changing, but the global nature of business is pretty. A lot of entities have that global footprint, and they don't always have the ability to understand who they're going to be going into business with. And often we see that situation, a situation where a company, starts operations in an area that might be high risk, could be someplace like China. They'll acquire a business that's already there. And then without having failed to do the due diligence of people in that business, they fail to see that there's, you find out later on the business is somewhat conflict of interest laden. There's all sorts of issues that show up later. So I think that obviously could subject them to, regulatory inquiry, prosecution even, but also more importantly, it subjects them to loss of assets. Money goes out the door. They're paying for stuff that they shouldn't be paying for. They're not getting services for what they do. And what we try to do is, we have that we're kind of the eyes and the ears to some extent for our clients in that way, in a way that we can kind of help them understand that the people they're doing business with and the context in which they're doing it. So I think that's an important aspect as well. So it really does run the gamut. And a lot of it is understanding the risks that the company is facing in whatever kind of business transaction they're looking to take.
So, one of the things that is, we hear a lot about, and we've talked about it on this podcast, is the emergence. And maybe it's not really the emergence, but maybe more of the top of mind identification of kind of ESG concerns, right? I think they've, to some respect, have always been there. But like you were talking about, when I've helped clients, with obtaining these due diligence investigations, we're really more worried about who we're doing business with and whether they're going to cause liability, right? And that's well documented. Third parties, outside of your compliance and your culture and all sorts of other issues can create the problems, and oftentimes do. But are you seeing more companies doing due diligence just from an ESG standpoint, so that they make sure that maybe while the company is adhering to certain ESG principles, making sure that they don't get in hot water with being affiliated with someone who, 6 months down the line, it blows up and they're doing things that are completely contrary to, maybe what's accepted or what the principles and goals of the company are from an ESG perspective?
No doubt. And obviously ESG is gaining greater regulatory attention. The SEC and other regulatory agencies are developing their approaches. I think the challenge with ESG to date has been a little bit of how do you quantify it? It's particularly the G part, governance has been always something we do, right?
Right.
But particularly the environmental and the social aspects of it is very difficult to figure out. How do you quantify that? Particularly we do a lot of work with private equity companies. They are more and more becoming conversant and interested in ESG. And some of that is, just because of the regulatory risk. Some of that is also being a boomer as I am. I think a lot of younger people, this is of interest to them. This is important to them. It's certainly important to our staff. I run our New York office, and I get questions like, why do we get a hard copy of the New York Times? And questions like that, and so people care about those things a lot. And so I do see that as an emerging request. And we are we've been developing our own kind of, and it's still developing because I think it's still developing generally our own approach to how we see ESG compliance and also how we see ESG due diligence. But we definitely wrap it into everything we do. And we, for a long time, kind of on the social side, I guess. I mean, we've particularly in the Middle East, and in Latin America, have been doing, this is less due diligence, more on the investigation side, but I guess you wrap it also into due diligence. We've been doing, like worker welfare investigations for a long time now. And so that's been something that, particularly in construction industries and other industries, obviously in manufacturing, that is something that, I think in Europe and the Middle East particularly, maybe also a bit in Asia, but definitely in Europe and Middle East have been a topic that we've done a lot of work. And I think it's kind of one of those areas where I kind of feel like the United States is lagging behind a little bit. I think, it's not something here, I think we're kind of catching up on some of the ESG stuff a little bit. I think we've seen it much more in our Europe, Middle East and Africa practice. So it's definitely something that we find that clients are asking about more and more. And I think, it could become a little bit of the FCPA for the 2020s into the 2030s. I think it's going to be an area that will continue to evolve. And I guess, again, I'm sure like you folks do, go into conferences, speak at conferences. It's hard to find a conference where you have either compliance or general counsel folks as the focal group and speakers where they don't have an ESG panel, right, people discussing ESG. You also, it's almost impossible to go to that panel and not have them all kind of throwing their hands up and saying, we don't exactly know what to do with this yet. So, we're looking at a lot of different ways of thinking about, is this almost like, think of it almost like SOX compliance was, so trying to find a framework to kind of put it in, I think is something that is going to be interesting to see how that develops.
I mean, Matthew and I and others at the firm certainly have taken a strong interest in trying to help companies articulate, where ESG risk lies. I mean, thematically, it's pretty clear. All the executive branch agencies have, in some way, shape, or form, DOJ created these environmental justice task forces. You've got all this messaging that's embracing, an enforcement regime consistent with the themes of ESG. Personally, I think, imagine we're young, aggressive prosecutors again, Brian, and we're trying to meet both public expectations, meet command intent. What's the kind of case, you're going to want to make? For me, it would be something like, a company says it's green, but in fact, in its smart battery technology development, it's, putting used batteries in groundwater and, poisoning a community and then lying about it. I mean, to me as a young prosecutor in the current, or even an old prosecutor for that matter, to me, I would say, sweet, that's a real ESG kind of case. And I can check lots of boxes there. It's environmentally irresponsible. It's socially irresponsible. It shows a lack of internal controls and awareness. And I would think that there's a lot of, regulators and enforcement investigators out there right now trying to make that case for some good reasons. And, what perhaps you could say was simply aspirational, a few years ago for a company to say, we aim to be green by 2023. And then you just kind of shrug and go to lunch. One wonders, because of the interest that, you pointed out in your staff, and I'm not looking to get you in trouble, but I can imagine let's call him a 25-year-old, says, do you believe this? They still get the New York Times in hard copy. And yet on the website, they claim to be committed to environmental values and priorities. This is outrageous.
Right.
And then that disgruntled person, who's forced to show up for work 3 days a week, becomes a whistleblower. So not to be too cynical about it, but I can imagine a world in which expectations among the stakeholders, management, the government, employees or counterparties are not all consistently aligned. I think there is a way to get it right. I think you can say in your due diligence, you're going to look hard at these ESG representations. Are they aspirational or are they promises, or, what's the meat behind the representation? But, not to turn this into an ESG talk, Matthew, I was joking with one of our colleagues who does, pretty much ESG all the time. And in looking at some of her slides, I said, geez, what's not ESG?
Right.
Just out of curiosity, what can't you fit under environmental, social, or governance? So again, I don't want to, hijack this into an ESG discussion, but I would think that as the risk environment evolves, you could have some good faith, well-meaning efforts put into meeting ESG expectations, which are not consistent with the expectations of regulators, enforcement people, or even investors or counterparties about what's the substance behind the rep. So I don't know. You're right that I think we could probably all do a better job articulating that risk.
Well, it's hard, right? I mean, like you said, there's some things that are kind of easy because, look, if you're trying to make money based upon promoting environmental, social goals, look, the number one thing that comes to mind is the Volkswagen, emissions case, mm-hmm. right? I mean, they were selling a product based upon promises of the low emissions, and it just was flatly false, right? And so that one's an easy one. You also start seeing some discussions among regulators. Brian, you mentioned private equity. Look, if you're raising money and you're saying that we are only investing in companies that fit this criteria, and that just is flatly false, and that is not, you're not making any efforts there, someone's going to come after you. But I think those are a little bit more black and white. I think what creates the uncertainty is kind of what you just talked about, Seth, is from a reputational standpoint, it isn't black and white. What fits within acceptable goals for environmental, social issues, especially because that means different things to different people. And when you're talking about looking at people that you're doing business with, counterparties, trying to think about all of the ways in which they may cause problems for you there, right? I mean, it could range everywhere from a business practice to who the CEO of the company is giving money to. And that maybe that politician ends up being corrupt and, maybe a horrible person. But it's kind of hard, I would think, trying to identify all of the areas of risk that could possibly be an issue, especially from a reputational standpoint.
Yeah, because we've got to impose some kind of rule of reason mm-hmm. onto this too. And it's hard maybe to get complete comfort there. But, just to clarify the record, I don't think it's environmentally unsound to get a hard copy of the New York Times every day. And, I'll confess to having a stacked floor to ceiling of old Outdoor Life magazines, and I still get the New Yorker in print edition, and there's really no justification for that at all. But to me, that would be sort of a rule of reason. And if that within your company, you're generating a little waste here and there, that would seem to be a reasonable level. And also with governance and also with social management, I mean, we all struggle to get these things right. I think the secret is, though, to have that reasonable explanation at hand,
right?
And to be consistent in the messaging. So I don't know, I'm going to broaden this up a little bit and ask you, Brian, a torturous question, perhaps, that was, presented to me, but also one that you probably, I would guess, hear regularly from clients or potential clients. In the due diligence area, let's say there's a company that's a good corporate citizen. It wants to be responsible. It wants to comply with the law, doesn't want to accidentally become a vehicle of money laundering or have the stain of bribery on its hands. So the question I often hear is, how much is enough, when it comes to due diligence? On the one hand, can we just rely on a contractual representation from a counterparty that we don't engage in FCPA violations, money laundering, or sanctions? Is that enough? If not, what would an outside party looking at us, whether that's the U.S. government, or somebody else looking at us, how do we know when we've done enough in terms of reasonable due diligence? And they often say we didn't go into, we want to be compliant, but we didn't go into business to be compliant. Matthew points out, well-meaning companies want to have ESG values, but at the end of the day, they want to create value, generate wealth for themselves and their employees and their investors and their counterparties. So this is a necessary, responsible thing to do. But are there any guiding principles for due diligence so that you can at some point cross a line where you feel comfortable that, look, I may not have been right at the end of the day. There may be some undetected risk in here that I may have to deal with. I get that. Life's uncertain. But I should at least feel confident that I was reasonable in the extent of due diligence in which I engaged. Any guiding principles for our clients or listeners?
It's a great question.
Look, it's very hard. I mean, obviously, it varies so much depending upon the circumstances. But I think one, having a process that is, and kind of some, again, it depends what kind of due diligence you're talking about. If you're talking about third-party due diligence, having some sort of protocol in terms of risk rating your third parties, and then kind of applying the level of due diligence based on that risk rating. And that risk rating, again, there's a lot of factors. There's the Transparency International, factors when you're dealing with corruption. It's, looking at geography. As I said before, it's looking at the regulatory environment of the industry, all of those things, thinking about that. Obviously, if you're in a country where there is a lot of government ownership, whether transparent or behind the scenes, that's an important factor. And laying out those factors and thinking about it, and then kind of weighing those factors in each case and to determine the level of due diligence you're going to do is I think very important. Having that documented, I think, is really important, because you're not going to be able to ensure that every agent who's working on your behalf, if you're operating in globally, particularly in high risk locations, is not going to pay a bribe on your behalf. It's just not. You can't prevent that 100%. What you can do is you can, do a level of due diligence up front, and then create perhaps some monitoring of that relationship, whether it is execution of audit rights or looking at expenditures and auditing your expenditures and doing some transaction work, whether you're doing it internally or bringing somebody else in to do it, just to look to see whether or not there is anything that is an outlier that looks suspicious, seems unjustified. And that's why I think data becomes really, really important in that process. So it's less in the due diligence, like the pre-relationship due diligence, and it's much more in looking at what's going on in the actual management of that relationship. Again, whether it's a third-party representative or obviously if you've acquired a business, looking at that. And I think that kind of monitoring, the ability of data to be able to kind of focus it and identify where risk lies, and then to make those deeper dives, I think is going to be very important going forward. And I think, you rarely go to a conference and of course the DOJ has spoken a lot about the use of data. I think data is going to be important. I realize I haven't answered your question 100% because I haven't really given you principles, but I think it's really a very case specific, factor specific thing. And look, a lot of times particularly when we do due diligence, we will often, phase it depending upon what the timing constraints are, because we'll say, look, let's start with the public record stuff. Let's try to figure out where there's the relationships that we can identify already. And then, from there, we can do something more intensive. And then, whether that's doing on the ground source inquiries, or if it's a context where there is the ability to look at books and records and look at transactions, we'll do that. And I think you have to really, a lot of it's a judgment call, I think. I know that's not a good answer. Just like what is good ESG is kind of, when you see it, it's not a good answer either.
No, look, I think that's fair. Matthew and I have often hit the headline of you've got to take a risk-based approach to compliance, and you've got to look specifically at how you do business. I think some company, look, if all you do are domestic transactions, your FCPA risk is probably relatively low. Right. So as a starting point, I think it's know thyself a little bit. At least that's the beginning, I think, of the conversations, that we have with clients. There's a lot, I've only, been here coming up on 2 years, but as the sanctions regime in particular has kind of, blown up, gotten a lot of really general questions about, do I need to rethink, how we do compliance in light of an evolving, sanctions regime? Or do I need to rethink, how artificial intelligence can be relied upon to do some of this stuff for me in an economically efficient way? So, we get a lot of general questions from companies who want to get it right. And, what I hear you saying, Brian, which makes sense to me is, depending on how you operate your business, this could be a completely, bespoke, transaction by transaction review. Because if this is the first time, you're doing business in Africa and you've only operated domestically before, you might not have the good habits built into your compliance program and you might need to develop some new habits or way of looking at things or scoping your due diligence. So some of it I get is bespoke. I mean, I would posit that probably the better a company knows itself, its history of business, if it has repeat customers and counterparties, the more confident it can be, that it's got that metric right. And the more the company is trying new things, in new geographic areas, or new areas of investment, maybe that tilts towards what I kind of hear you saying, which is a little bit more bespoke approach to let's take a really hard look at what you're trying to do and where you're trying to do it. And then you, Brian, control risk, can tell you, if you've done enough, but it's hard to give that level of comfort at the outset.
That's right. Look, it's us, and obviously it's us with you. I mean, with counsel. I mean, I think the other thing is, we do deal with market entry a lot. In that context, where clients are going in for the first time. And look, the benefit of obviously being a little bit more robust there is one, the client doesn't know a lot about that yet, and that environment, and they're going to learn a lot about it. That's not only going to maybe be relevant for this transaction, but for additional transactions that they're going to maybe potentially do in that environment. It's particularly when I talk to like colleagues of mine, we do a lot of work in places where politically exposed people become a very, very big issue. Places like Saudi Arabia, Middle East, and it's kind of interesting because almost everybody who owns a company in some of these countries seems to be related to a prince, or it's like it's an amazing thing, or has a relationship, or has worked for a prince. I mean,
I wish I had that complication in my own life, but
right. I'm in my seventh decade. I haven't met a prince yet. So there you go. But so I think it is kind of. It's also helpful. I think the process is helpful to educate everybody involved a little bit about what they're facing here, because I think sometimes the risk can be. I don't think they're oriented towards generating value for their stakeholders and maybe not really fully appreciating the risk yet. So it's also good to know that, because it's not only about making a decision whether or not to do the transaction, right? That's an important factor. We don't, we like to think that we're not really in the business of telling people, you shouldn't do something. We're in the business of saying, this is how you should do it, based on what we've identified as issues. And so I think that can be very challenging. I have a client that's actually become very acquisitive outside of kind of what their core area was. For example, they did one thing and now they're doing other things, and they're, kind of diversifying as a group. But that's really, in that context, kind of understanding that if you're a construction company, that's what you do. That's going to be a lot different than the risks that are going to be if you're doing consulting or if you're going to go into this field or that field. So I think it's really important to know, to kind of also educate yourself through the process of what the risks are, and then to also understand how you would mitigate those risks if you decide to go forward. And I think that's as important as sometimes the upfront due diligence is what you do with it once you decide to go forward.
So, Brian, we always like to, leave our listeners with some, things to think about and how to maybe think about how to improve their own compliance program or how they're operating. I mean, and you mentioned one thing that I'd like for you to explore a little bit more is the use of data, right? I mean, we talked about like these kind of upfront due diligence, but as you start, as you do your good work and you start seeing what kind of best practices are, or maybe where even companies kind of miss the boat by not doing data analytics. Talk a little bit about kind of what kind of data, may be available and what kind of data analytics companies should be thinking about doing to help kind of identify, once they have that relationship, to kind of monitor that relationship to help spot, red flags.
Yes, I'm sure. I mean, I think when I talk about data analytics in this context, I'm probably largely talking, obviously, about finance and accounting data mainly.
Okay.
And, it although not entirely, I suppose, but I think it's really looking to interrogate your data on a regular basis just to be able to identify transactions that seem out of the norm. And so that can be looking at data to see if there are odd payment terms. You have transactions with company A in country Z, and they're making payments to another company in country Y, and that type of thing. Or it can be looking at round dollar payments, or it can be looking at a high volume of travel and entertainment expenses, or it can be looking for out of comparing different regions and looking and seeing that there's a higher volume of consultant payments. And is that really justified? Maybe it is. Maybe it is that we need consultants. We need the services of consultants in this jurisdiction more than we need than others, because we don't have the on the ground resources of our own. But yet understanding that, so it's really just more trying to find places where transactions or outside of what would be the expected in the norm are occurring. So I think it's really important. And then I think it's something that and what we help clients do a lot of is, developing. Our data analytical people are very good about developing dashboards and visualization to help kind of make it pretty simple for our clients, not because they couldn't handle the complex stuff, because they could intellectually, they don't have time.
Right.
So helping them develop dashboards and things so they can look at something and say, that doesn't seem right today. Let me find out who I have to ask about that and figure out why that is. So I think that's the kind of ability that data gives people. I also think it's what the regulators and prosecutors, particularly DOJ, are going to be expecting a lot more of. And I think the challenge is going to be, I'm not a data analyst. I actually kind of like numbers, but numbers can become a dark hole. And so the question is, getting that right balance of getting the information you need that's the most important, and understanding why that's the most important to you, documenting why it is, and relying upon that information and acting on it, I think is really important. Because like with all of these compliance related things, you have information at your fingertips. The important thing is also to act upon it when you should. I mean, it's, that's always been the case. It's like, what do you look at when you look at any sort of corporate malfeasance? If somebody does something wrong, were they disciplined, right? If you have a policies and procedures that say, if you violate our code of conduct, you are subject to discipline, including termination, but you never terminate or discipline anybody who violates the code of conduct. That's almost worse than not having a code of conduct at all. So I think it's really important to be able to kind of utilize data to kind of educate you on what's going on and then respond to it in an appropriate fashion. And I think that's, what we try to help our clients do.
That's great.
Does that help?
Great.
No, that's, I think that's exactly right. I think that data is, Seth asked a good question. How far do you go on due diligence, right? But the problem with data is it's sitting there, and in 2020 hindsight, it always looks obvious. So it's the question of, what do you look at and how do you look at it? And again, not to be a dead horse here, but it must be risk-based, right? And really at that point, you just need to really think about what data is going to help you identify potential red flags. And that has to be, let's think about, and it needs to be an evolving thing, right? But let's think about where our risks lie. Like a perfect example that we ran across in an investigation was that the company was doing business with a distributor, and the distributor served what became a sanctioned area. And so, if you're going to continue to do business with that distributor, and all of a sudden the distributor starts doing about the same sales to a completely new company, well, okay, you need to be thinking through and kind of looking at that, because you need to be thinking about the obvious issues of diversion there, right? Have they just changed? Are they basically selling your products into the same region? Are they just routing it in a different way? And that's a simplistic, easy one. But data is a pretty powerful tool, and it kind of goes back to the issue of compliance and controls cannot be set it and forget it, right? It has to be an evolving thing. because risk evolve, as new regulations come into play, as your business comes into play. Like you said, the ability of a company 20 years to do business internationally versus what it takes today is amazingly different. Technology has made it possible for small companies to be international, and there comes, a lot of risk. And so, no, I think that's exactly right. And thinking through with, teams like yours that, deal with these issues all the time of like, how do you deal with the data that you have so that, ultimately you want to avoid, having issues, right? That's the goal, but also if you do have issues, which are, nothing's foolproof, be able to explain that you had a reasonable process and didn't miss the big blinking red light in the corner of the room that'll be so obvious to a prosecutor later on.
And I guess one other thing I'll add to that is, what did you do after you found out the problem?
Oh, yeah.
What changes did you make? So what did you, besides, discontinuing potentially the relationship, whether it's with an employee or with an outside party, what new controls did you put in place? How did you kind of look to mitigate that risk going forward?
Absolutely.
And so I think that's really important. It's evolving for sure.
This conversation has gone, very quickly. I can think of a lot of other things, we could talk about with you, and really, really grateful that you've come on. I'm also intrigued by your bodyguarding and kidnap and ransomware component. It might be fun to talk to you or one of your colleagues sometime about advising our audience, how to know when you need a bodyguard and a kidnap and ransom insurance policy in your back pocket, because that may be material to their travel plan.
There's no question.
I'll put a marker down for that, and just want to thank you again very much. Always great to see you, and always great to see you as well, Matthew. And until next time.
Well, thank you for joining us for this episode of Sidebar. You can get this episode and others off of the Bracewell website and anywhere where you get your podcast.